Caleb Horn pulled the dead woman's frozen fingers apart and found a child underneath her. A little girl, blonde, barely breathing. He looked at the mother's face, eyes closed, expression peaceful in the way that only death made peaceful. And he understood what she had done. She had wrapped herself around her children like a shell and spent the last heat in her body keeping them alive. Then he heard it, a second breath, smaller, faster. He moved the girl aside and found the boy, both alive. Caleb Horn, the man who had killed their father, pulled them both out of the snow. If this story stopped your heart just now, stay with me. Subscribe to this channel, follow every part to the end, and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to the beginning. The wagon had been buried for 2 days. Caleb only found it because Scout refused to move. The mare stopped dead on the ridge, all 4 hooves locked, ears flat, and no amount of heel or voice would push her another step forward. In 10 years of riding, Scout had never refused him. Caleb knew better than to argue with a horse that was smarter than he was. He dismounted and walked toward whatever she smelled. The draw was shallow, maybe 15 feet down from the trail, hidden under a shelf of drifted snow that had built up against a granite outcrop. The wagon sat at the bottom. Canvas collapsed, one wheel shattered, the mule traces cut clean. Someone had cut them deliberately. That meant at least one person had been alive and thinking when the worst of the storm hit. Caleb pulled back the canvas with one hand and kept the other on his colt. The woman was sitting upright. Her arms were around 2 children, one on each side, pressed flat against her body. She had given them her coat, her blanket, every layer she owned. She had nothing left on her but a thin cotton dress, frozen stiff against her skin. Her face was still. Caleb pressed 2 fingers against her throat and held them there long enough to be certain. Then he took off his hat. He had seen death in a dozen forms across a dozen states. It never stopped meaning something. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "the way you say it when there is nothing else to say, and silence feels wrong." Then the girl opened her eyes, gray-blue, like storm sky, and they locked onto his face with an intensity that would have startled a man who startled easy. "Don't touch her," the girl said. Her voice was cracked and dry as split wood. "I won't," Caleb said. He did not move. "My name's Caleb Horn. I got a ranch south of here, just outside Granger." He kept his voice level, the way you kept your hands level around a horse that had been hit before. "I ain't here to hurt you." The girl stared at him. She did not blink. "Your mama?" he said carefully. "Gone." One word. Flat. Final. Like she had already said it to herself 100 times through the night to make it real. Since before the snow stopped last time. How long ago was that? Yesterday morning? She shifted slightly, and Caleb saw her wince. Her legs had been locked in the same position for hours, maybe longer. "Maybe the morning before. I lost count." "You hurt anywhere?" "No." "Hungry?" Something crossed her face. Not quite yes. More like the memory of yes, remembered from a time before hunger stopped feeling like anything at all. "My brother needs water more than I need food." Caleb looked at the boy on the other side of the woman. Dark-haired, younger than the girl, maybe 5 or 6. His skin was the wrong color, too pale, with 2 red patches high on his cheeks that meant fever, not cold. He pressed his fingers against the boy's neck. Pulse there, fast and thin, but there. "He's alive," Caleb said. The girl exhaled once, hard, like she had been holding that breath since yesterday morning. "His name's Eli," she said. "He doesn't talk. Not since Mama got sick. He understands everything, he just—" She stopped. He just doesn't talk right now." "Okay," Caleb said. He reached into his coat and unhooked his canteen. He held it out to the girl. "Drink first. Slow. Then I'm going to get your brother out, then you. We ride to Granger, get you both warm. You understand?" The girl looked at the canteen. She looked at his face. She was measuring him the way children measured adults when adults had already proven themselves unreliable. Not with anger, just with the flat, careful attention of someone who had learned that trust cost more than it paid. She took the canteen. She drank 3 swallows and stopped, which told Caleb she had more discipline than most grown men he had ridden with. "What's your name?" he asked. "Nora." She handed the canteen back. "Nora Ashford." Caleb lifted Eli out of the wagon first. The boy's body was limp, but not dead limp. There was muscle resistance, the resistance of unconscious sleep, not absence. He wrapped his own coat around the boy before he had fully cleared the wagon wall and held him against his chest. Eli's eyes opened. Dark brown, wide, unfocused at first, then slowly pulling in toward Caleb's face. The boy looked at him the way people looked at things when they weren't sure if the thing was real or part of a dream they were still inside. Caleb said nothing. He just held him steady. After a moment, Eli turned his face into Caleb's chest and closed his eyes again. "He likes you," Nora said from the wagon. She said it like it surprised her. "He's cold and I'm warm," Caleb said. "Ain't about liking." "No," Nora said quietly. "It ain't just that." She climbed out of the wagon herself, refusing the hand Caleb offered, getting her own footing on the icy slope with the grim stubbornness of a child who had decided that accepting help and needing help were 2 different things, and she would choose which one applied. She made it up the draw on her own, slipping once and catching herself, and she did not look back at the wagon. She did not look back at her mother. Caleb saw that and understood it. Sometimes you couldn't look back. Sometimes looking back was the thing that finished you. They reached Scout at the top of the draw. The mare turned her head and regarded Eli in Caleb's arms with one dark, steady eye, then stood perfectly still while Caleb settled the boy against his chest and swung up into the saddle. "You ever ridden before?" he asked Nora. "Some." "Get up behind me. Hold my jacket, not my arm. If Scout spooks, I need my arm free." Nora put her foot in the stirrup and pulled herself up with arms that were shaking from cold and 2 days of held together. She wrapped both hands in the back of Caleb's jacket and did not say another word. They rode south. The storm had dropped to a low whisper of wind and scattered flurries. The kind of quiet that came after a blizzard had said everything it had to say. The sky was white and wide and empty. The land was white and wide and empty. In Wyoming in December, the world reduced itself to a few simple facts. And you either dealt with those facts or you didn't. After a 1/4 mile, Nora spoke behind him. "There's a bag in the wagon. Mama's bag. There's papers in it." "I'll go back for it." "The papers matter." Her voice was careful. "Mama said if something happened to her, the papers were the most important thing. More important than anything else we had." "What kind of papers?" Silence for a moment. The sound of Scout's hooves in the snow. "Land papers," Nora said. "Papa left land to me and Eli. Mama said someone was trying to take it." A pause. "She said that's why we were running." "Running from who?" Nora's hands tightened in his jacket. She called him Uncle Harlan, but she didn't say it like he was family. She said it like it was something that used to be true and wasn't anymore. Caleb filed that away behind his face where it didn't show. They came into Granger from the north road, just as the light shifted from gray to the thin, pale gold that passed for morning in December. Main Street was already stirring. Smoke from chimneys, a man leading a horse from the livery, the sound of an axe splitting wood somewhere behind the feed store. Tommy Briggs, who swept the porch of the general store every morning without fail, looked up from his broom and stared at Caleb's horse with his mouth open. Caleb watched the boy's eyes go from Eli to Nora to the expression on Caleb's face. And he watched Tommy drop the broom and run. By the time Caleb reached Ruth McAllister's eating house, Ruth was already on the porch. She was a woman who had raised 6 children alone after her husband died of a fever in '64, who had kept her business open through 3 hard winters and 1 range war, and who had the particular quality of stillness that came not from calm, but from having decided long ago that panic was a luxury she couldn't afford. She stood on that porch with a wool blanket in her arms and looked at the children on Caleb's horse, and her jaw set hard. "Bring them in," she said. "Right now." She didn't ask what happened. She didn't ask whose children they were. She stepped back, held the door, and when Caleb carried Eli inside, she already had the bench nearest the fire cleared and the blanket ready. "Set him here." She took Eli from Caleb's arms with the practiced ease of a woman who had handled sick children before, settled him on the bench, pressed the back of her hand against his forehead and his cheek. "He's burning up." She looked up at Caleb. "How long?" "Don't know. At least 2 days in the cold." "Lord." She pulled the blanket tight around Eli and looked at Nora, who had come through the door behind Caleb and was standing in the middle of the room with her arms at her sides, dripping snowmelt onto the floorboards, watching her brother. "Honey, you sit down right here, close to the fire." "I'm fine," Nora said. "You're half frozen, and you don't know it yet. Because you've been cold so long, your body forgot what warm feels like." Ruth pointed at the chair beside Eli's bench. "Sit down." Nora sat. Ruth looked at Caleb, and her voice dropped to the register that meant the children weren't meant to hear. "Their mama?" "North Draw, 3 miles out." He kept his face level. "She's gone." "Been gone since yesterday, at least. I'll go back with Dolan when the boy is stable." Ruth's expression held for a moment, then shifted into something that wasn't quite grief. It was the look of a woman absorbing one more hard thing into an already heavy load. She nodded once. "I'll keep them here today. Both of them." She glanced at Nora. "She's not going anywhere, and neither is he." "I need to go back for their bag," Caleb said. "There are papers in it." "Go. I'll watch them." He was at the door when Nora's voice stopped him. "Mr. Horn?" He turned. She was sitting straight in the chair beside her brother, her hands folded in her lap, her gray-blue eyes steady on his face. She looked exhausted and cold, and about 9 years old and approximately 40 years old at the same time. "You're coming back," she said. It was not quite a question. "Yes." "People say that." "I know they do." He held her gaze. "I'm coming back, Nora." She looked at him for one long moment. Then she turned back to her brother and put her hand over his under the blanket. Caleb rode back north into the white. He found the wagon the same way he had found it the first time, Scout smelling something wrong before Caleb saw it. He went down the draw, back to the woman in the frozen blue dress, and he spent 20 minutes doing what needed doing. Wrapping her in the canvas from the wagon floor, marking the location with stones stacked high enough to be seen from the trail. He would come back with Dolan and do it right. For now, this was what he had. He picked up the bag from the wagon floor before he climbed back out. He opened it on the ridge, his back to the wind, Scout standing patient beside him. Inside, children's clothes, worn thin. A small Bible, black cover, names written inside in a careful hand. A purse with $11 in change. And at the bottom, a leather folder tied with cord. He untied it. Land deed, Colorado Territory, registered to Nora Ashford and Eli Ashford, minors, heirs of Samuel Ashford. 412 acres, survey dated 1874. And beneath the deed, a letter. Folded and refolded until the creases had gone soft. He opened it. The handwriting was a man's, heavy-pressured, slightly slanted. The hand of someone who had learned to write hard things. Margaret, if you're reading this, then the worst has happened, and I didn't get ahead of it. Take the children west. Don't stop. Don't trust anyone connected to Harlan. He's been watching the deed since Papa died, and now that I'm gone, he'll come for the land through the children. He knows the law gives him a road in through guardianship. Find someone honest and stay put. The land belongs to Nora and Eli. Don't let him touch it. I'm sorry I left you carrying this. I'm sorry for all of it. Tell Nora her papa loved her. Tell Eli the same when he talks again. Samuel. Caleb read it twice. He looked at the name. Samuel. He looked at the Bible in the bag, at the names inside the cover, written in that same careful hand. Samuel Ashford, born 1844. The date hit him before the name finished landing. Boonville, Missouri, October 1874. A road in the dark, a figure moving fast in the shadows. A Pinkerton detective 4 years on the job, certain he was following a wanted man, drawing and firing before he'd gotten close enough to be sure. Samuel Ashford, 30 years old, unarmed, walking back to his horse. Dead before he hit the ground. Caleb had stood over that body in the mud and understood in the space of 3 seconds that he had just destroyed his own life and someone else's simultaneously. He had turned in his badge the next morning. He had ridden west without stopping until he ran out of road in Granger, Wyoming, and told himself he was done. He was not done. Samuel Ashford's daughter had just asked him if he was coming back, and he had said yes. Samuel Ashford's son was burning with fever on a bench in Ruth McAllister's eating house. Caleb sat on his horse on a ridge in Wyoming in December and held a dead man's letter in his hands and looked at the white sky and said nothing at all for a long time. Then he folded the letter, put it in the bag, and rode back to Granger. When he walked through Ruth's door, Nora looked up from her brother's side, and something in her face shifted. Not relief exactly, more like the careful, grudging acknowledgement that this time, this once, someone had done what they said. "You came back," she said. "Told you I would." "Mama's bag?" He set it on Ruth's counter. "It's all there." Nora looked at the bag. Then she looked at Caleb's face, and she was quiet for a moment, in the way of someone reading something they weren't expecting to find. "You okay?" she asked. The question, from a 9-year-old girl who had watched her mother freeze to death, hit Caleb somewhere he did not have adequate armor for. "I'm fine," he said. "You look like you saw a ghost," Nora said. "Just the cold," Caleb said. "Go sit with your brother." She held his gaze 1 beat longer. Then she went. Ruth appeared at Caleb's shoulder, coffee in hand, voice low. "Man named Harland Grove was in town last week. Well-dressed. Asked after a woman and 2 children traveling west. Left his card with Reverend Stanton." Her eyes were steady on his face. "Said he was family. Said he was worried sick." Caleb said nothing. "Said if anyone saw them, send word immediately." Ruth paused. "Tommy Briggs saw you ride in with those children. Half the town saw you ride in. Word moves fast in Granger, Caleb." "I know it does." "So you understand what I'm telling you?" "I do." He looked at Nora across the room, her small back bent over her brother, her hand wrapped around Eli's. "Grove comes anywhere near those children, you come find me first, before Dolan, before anyone." Ruth looked at him the way she sometimes looked at him, like she was trying to see past the surface of him to whatever was underneath, and hadn't fully decided yet whether she liked what she was finding. "You know something about this family," she said, not a question. "Some," Caleb said. "You gonna tell me what?" "Not yet." Ruth held his gaze for a long moment. Then she handed him the coffee. "Drink that. You look like death." The door opened, and Frank Dolan came in, snow on his coat, Deputy Starr catching the firelight. He was a man who needed procedure the way other men needed whiskey. It steadied him, gave him something solid to walk toward when everything else shifted. He looked at the children. He looked at Caleb. "Found them north of town," Caleb said, before Dolan could frame the question. "Mother's dead. Storm got her. Children are alive. They're staying here with Ruth until the boy's fever breaks." Dolan turned his hat in his hands. He looked at Nora, who looked back at him with those flat, measuring eyes. And then he looked at Eli, and whatever he was going to say shifted slightly into something more human. "I'll need a report," he said. "Come find me this afternoon," Caleb said. "I'll ride back out with you to the wagon. Do it proper." Dolan nodded. He moved toward the door, then stopped with his hand on the frame. "Grove's been asking around again," he said, his back still to the room. "Stopped by my office yesterday morning. Real polite, real patient." He paused. "I don't trust patient men." "Neither do I," Caleb said. Dolan left. The door closed. The fire settled. Ruth refilled Caleb's coffee without being asked. Caleb crossed the room and sat down on the floor beside Eli's bench, his back against the wall, his knees up. Nora looked down at him from her chair. "Why are you sitting on the floor?" she asked. "Easier to keep an eye on the door from down here." Nora considered this. Then she slid off the chair and sat beside him on the floor, shoulder inches from his arm, her eyes on the door now, too. "Mr. Horn," she said after a moment. "Reckon you can call me Caleb." "Caleb," she tested the word. "Are you going to stay?" He looked at the fire. He thought about Samuel Ashford's letter, about a road in Missouri in the dark, about the particular weight of a thing that could not be undone and could not be outrun, no matter how far west you pointed your horse. "Yes," he said. "You sure?" "I'm sure." "How sure?" Caleb looked at her sideways. "About as sure as a man gets about anything, which I'll grant you ain't as sure as either of us would like. But sure enough." Nora was quiet. Then, almost too low to hear, "Papa used to say, sure enough was the most honest kind of sure there was. Because nothing's all the way certain. Things just matter enough that you show up anyway." Caleb had no answer for that. He didn't try to find one. He sat on the floor of Ruth McAllister's eating house in Granger, Wyoming, in December of 1878, with Samuel Ashford's daughter pressed against his arm and Samuel Ashford's son breathing fever hot above him. And he made himself one promise. Not a noble one, not a brave one, just a plain one. He would not leave these children. Not because he deserved to stay. Not because he had any right to call himself protector of the family whose father he had killed. But because Samuel's letter had asked Margaret to find someone honest and stay put. And Samuel had not gotten to choose who that someone turned out to be. And this was what the world had offered in his place. Caleb Horn. The wrong man in the right place at the right time. The last option standing. He looked at the door. Outside, somewhere in Granger or somewhere close to it, a man named Harland Grove was patient and well-dressed and waiting. And he was about to find out these children were no longer alone. Eli's fever broke sometime before dawn. Caleb knew it the moment it happened, because the boy's breathing changed. From the fast, shallow pull of a body fighting something it couldn't name, to the slower, deeper rhythm of genuine sleep. He had been sitting on the floor beside the bench for 4 hours, his back against the wall, his rifle across his knees, and he felt the change the way you felt a shift in wind direction before you heard it or saw it. Something in the room went quieter. He reached up and pressed the back of his hand against Eli's forehead. Still warm, but the burning was gone. Nora was asleep in the chair on the other side of the bench, her head tilted against her shoulder, her hands folded in her lap, even in sleep, like she didn't trust herself to let go of things, even when she wasn't conscious. Ruth had put a blanket over her an hour ago without waking her, moving with the practiced silence of a woman who had tucked in enough children to know how to do it without disturbing them. Caleb looked at the boy's face in the low firelight. Dark hair, thick brows, the soft, unfinished features of a child who had not yet grown into his own face. He looked like his mother. Caleb had only seen Margaret Ashford in death, frozen and still in the bottom of a buried wagon. But even then he had been able to see the architecture of her face in her children's faces. Nora had her eyes. Eli had everything else. He did not look like Samuel Ashford. Caleb was grateful for that, in a way that shamed him slightly. He stood carefully, his knees protesting the hours on the floor, and walked to the window. Main Street was dark and empty. The snow blew white under a half moon. The buildings on the other side of the street just shapes, just dark wood and dark glass. Nothing moved. That was the thing about patient men. They didn't move when you were watching for them. They moved when you weren't. Ruth came out of the back room, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders, and stopped when she saw Caleb at the window. "Fever's down," he said quietly. She crossed to Eli and checked him herself, the way she always verified things independently, not because she didn't trust what she was told, but because she believed that the person who checked for themselves was the person who actually knew. She nodded once. "He needs broth when he wakes," she said, "and he needs it slow. Don't let him eat fast no matter how hungry he is." She straightened. "Children who've been that cold and hungry, they'll eat themselves sick if you let them." "I know." Ruth looked at him. "You know a lot of things about children for a man who doesn't have any." Caleb said nothing. He looked at the window. "I'm not prying," Ruth said. "I'm observing. There's a difference." She moved to the stove and began building the fire back up for morning. Man who knows how to talk to scared children knows how to hold a sick one, knows to sit on the floor instead of stand over them. That ain't something you learn from nothing. She set a log on the coals without looking up. "Something happened to you. I don't know what it was, but it changed how you move around people." "Ruth, I'm not asking you to tell me." "Good. I'm just saying I see it." She dusted her hands and stood. "And I'm saying whatever it was, it made you useful tonight." So, she turned toward the back room. "I'll be up in 2 hours. You sleep if you can." Caleb didn't sleep. He sat back down on the floor beside the bench and listened to the building breathe around him. The tick of the stove, the settle of old wood in the cold, the sound of 2 children who were alive when they should not have been. Nora woke just before first light. She came out of sleep the way she did everything, without fuss, without transition. Eyes open and immediately focused, like sleep was just a door she walked through and woke on the other side of fully assembled. She looked at Eli first. She put her hand on his forehead. She exhaled. Then she looked at Caleb on the floor. "You didn't sleep," she said. "Slept some," Caleb said. "That's a lie." "It's a partial lie," Caleb said. "Partial lies are different." Nora looked at him with an expression that was not quite a smile, but was adjacent to one. The expression of a child who had decided something was slightly less terrible than expected. "Mama used to say there was no such thing as a partial lie." She said a lie was a lie, the same way a hole was a hole. Size didn't matter. You were either in it or you weren't. Your mama sounds like she was a tough woman. She was the toughest person I ever knew, Nora said. She said it without any wobble in her voice, which told Caleb she had been saying it to herself in the dark for the last 2 days, until it was solid enough to say out loud. She wasn't big or loud. She didn't yell or carry on. She just decided things. And then they were decided. A pause. Papa used to say she could move a mountain without raising her voice. Just look at it long enough, until the mountain figured out it ought to move. He sounds like he knew her well. They were good together, Nora said. She was quiet for a moment. Before he died, they were real good together. Another pause, smaller, more careful. After he died, Mama was different. Not broken, just smaller. Like she was taking up less room on purpose. Caleb kept his voice even. "How'd your papa die?" He knew. He needed to hear her say it. He needed to know what she knew. Nora looked at the fire. "Shot," she said. "On a road in Missouri. A man made a mistake in the dark." She said it with a flatness that was not coldness. It was the flatness of a wound that had been examined so many times it had stopped bleeding, even if it hadn't healed. Mama said it was an accident, that the man didn't know, that he thought Papa was someone else. Did she know who did it? She knew he was a Pinkerton man. That's all she said. Nora turned and looked directly at Caleb. She said holding on to who it was wouldn't bring Papa back. Said it would just give the grief somewhere to live that wasn't us. A beat. I used to be angry she wasn't more angry. And now? Nora looked back at the fire. Now I think she was right. Being angry at something that's done just burns up what you need for what's coming. Caleb Horn sat on the floor in the growing morning light and let those words land on him without flinching. He owed her that much. He owed her the truth, too. He knew that. But the truth was a weapon that needed to be picked up at the right moment, or it would cut the person holding it. This was not the right moment. This child was 9 years old, and her brother had almost died last night, and her mother was wrapped in canvas in a snow-covered draw 3 miles north of here. The right moment would come. He would not hide from it when it did, but it was not now. Ruth came out of the back at first light with a pot of broth on the stove before either of them spoke again, and the morning began. And with it came the thing Caleb had been waiting for since he rode back into Granger the afternoon before. Harland Grove walked through the door at 8 o'clock. Caleb heard the boots on the porch steps first. Measured, deliberate. A man who put his feet down with intention. Then the door opened, and cold air moved through the room, and Caleb was on his feet before he had consciously decided to stand. Grove was maybe 50, which on some men looked like weathering, and on others looked like preservation. On Grove, it looked like preservation. The kind that came from living carefully, from spending money on the right things, from never being in a room where he wasn't in control of the temperature. Dark coat, good quality. Gray at the temples, which on his particular face looked like an asset rather than an age. His eyes were the flat, even color of river slate, and they moved across the room in a single pass that cataloged everything in it. They stopped on Nora. Nora had gone still the way small animals went still when something larger entered the space. Not with fear exactly, but with the sudden redirection of all available attention toward the new variable. Grove smiled. It was a well-made smile, the kind assembled from the right parts in the right order. "Nora," he said, and his voice was warm and familiar and slightly too practiced to be either. "Lord, child, we have been worried sick about you." Nora said nothing. Grove took a step into the room. Caleb shifted his weight, and Grove's eyes moved to him for the first time. "Mr. Horn," Grove said pleasantly, "I've heard a good deal about you this past day." He extended his hand across the distance between them. "Harland Grove, I'm these children's uncle." Caleb did not take the hand. He stood where he was and looked at Grove with the flat, particular attention of a man who had spent 10 years watching other men's hands and mouths and eyes simultaneously, and learning which one told the truth when the other two were lying. "I know who you are." Something adjusted in Grove's expression. Not his smile. The smile stayed, but something behind it recalibrated, a slight sharpening, like a man who had walked into a room expecting a certain kind of conversation and was now reassessing. "Then you know I have family business here," Grove said. "My brother's children are not going anywhere," Caleb said. Grove turned to Nora. "Sweetheart, your father was my brother. You know that. Your mama used to bring you to visit when you were small. You might not remember." "I remember," Nora said. Grove smiled wider. "Of course you do. You were always sharp." He crouched down to her level, which was a calculated move, and Caleb saw it for what it was. "I know you've been through something terrible. I know you lost your mama. I am so sorry about that." His voice dropped into something that sounded like gentleness. "But you're not alone now. That's what I came to tell you. You and Eli. You have family. You have me." Nora looked at him for a long time. Then she said, "Mama told me not to go with you." The smile did not falter. A lesser man's smile would have. "Your mama was frightened, sweetheart. She wasn't thinking clearly toward the end. She didn't understand that I only wanted to help. She was thinking clearly right up until she stopped breathing," Nora said. "She thought clearer than anyone I ever knew. If she said something, she meant it." A beat of silence. Ruth, behind the counter, was studying the inside of a coffee cup with great concentration. Grove stood back up. He looked at Caleb, and the warmth in his face had not left, but something had been added to it. A kind of acknowledgement. The acknowledgement of one man to another that they were now operating on a different level of conversation. "Mr. Horn, I appreciate what you did for these children. Finding them, bringing them in out of the storm. That took decency. I respect that." He paused. "But I think you can see that this situation is beyond your involvement now. These are my brother's children. Blood relation. The law is clear on this matter." "I reckon the law'll decide that when it gets here," Caleb said. "I've already spoken to Deputy Dolan," Grove said, "and I've sent a rider to Judge Alderman in Casper. The matter of guardianship will be heard within the month." His voice stayed even and pleasant, the voice of a man explaining a weather forecast. Something that was going to happen regardless of how anyone felt about it. "I'm not asking you to fight me on this, Mr. Horn. I'm asking you to step back from a situation that was never yours to begin with." Caleb took one step forward. It was not a threatening step. It was a deliberate step. The kind that closed the distance between two people by exactly the amount required to make the conversation private. He kept his voice low, and he kept it level. "Samuel Ashford wrote his wife a letter before he died," Caleb said. "Told her to take those children west and stay away from you. Told her you wanted the land deed. Told her you'd come at the children through guardianship if you could." He watched Grove's face. "That letter's in a bag on Ruth's counter. I've read it. And before this day is out, I'm going to make sure every person in a position of authority in this territory has read it too." Something moved through Grove's eyes, fast and controlled and cold. "A letter written by a man who died 4 years ago," Grove said. "In an unstable state of mind, I might add. The drink had him toward the end. Everyone who knew Samuel knew that. His voice stayed pleasant. His eyes did not. Letters like that don't hold up well in court, Mr. Horn, especially when weighed against a living blood relative with means and standing. Maybe, Caleb said. We'll find out. Grove held his gaze for a moment that stretched slightly past comfortable. Then he stepped back, and the warmth came back into his face, the way a man put on his coat before walking outside, automatically, without having to think about it. He looked at Nora. "I'll be in Granger," he said to her gently. "When you're ready to talk, you come find me. I'll be at the boarding house." He looked at Eli on the bench. "I hope your brother feels better soon." He said it with a softness that would have been convincing if Caleb hadn't been watching his eyes, which had not gone soft at all. Grove put his hat on and walked out. The room held its breath for 3 seconds after the door closed. Then Nora let out a long, slow exhale through her nose. "He killed my papa," she said quietly. The room went absolutely still. Caleb looked at her. "What did you say?" "Mama told me. Not at first. She told me when we left Kansas City." Nora's voice was careful and flat, each word placed like a foot on uncertain ground. "She said Uncle Harland had been giving Papa whiskey. Good whiskey, expensive whiskey. More than Papa could afford on his own. Papa was—" She stopped, restarted. "Papa had trouble with the drink after the first year. Mama said Harland knew that and used it. Said Harland kept him drinking on purpose. Kept him from being able to manage the land or the deed or anything. And when Papa finally died of it, Harland came for the papers the same week." Caleb said nothing. He was thinking about Samuel's letter, about the word watching, about the particular patience of a man who didn't need to use a knife if he had enough time and enough whiskey, and a brother who trusted him. "Mama couldn't prove it," Nora continued. "She said that was the worst part, not what he did, that she couldn't prove it and knew she never would." She looked up at Caleb. "She said some men were too careful to be caught, that the only way to beat them was to get far enough away that they couldn't reach you anymore." "She was right about that," Caleb said. "She didn't get far enough," Nora said. The words settled in the room like stones dropping into still water. Caleb pulled out the chair across from Nora and sat down at Ruth's table. He put his hands flat on the surface where she could see them. He looked at her directly. "Nora, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer me straight." "Okay." "The land deed. Do you know what it covers? How much?" 400 acres in Colorado," she said without hesitation. "Papa bought it the year before I was born. He said it was going to be ours, mine and Eli's, no matter what else happened. Said he put it in our names so that nothing could touch it. Not debt, not bad years, not anything." She paused. "He didn't know about Harlan, I don't think. Not then. Or he thought Harlan would leave it alone." "He was wrong about that." "He was wrong about Harlan being a lot of things," Nora said quietly. "Mama said that was Papa's hardest lesson. That not everybody who called you family meant it the same way you meant it back." Eli stirred on the bench. A small sound, not quite a word, just a breath with direction in it. Nora was up and beside him in 2 steps, her hand on his forehead, her voice dropping into a low, wordless murmur that was the particular language of a sister talking to a little brother. Not really words at all, just sound, just presence, just the message that she was there and everything was still intact. Eli opened his eyes. He looked at the ceiling. He looked at Nora. He looked, slowly, across the room at Caleb, sitting at the table. Caleb did not move, did not smile, did not wave, did not do any of the things that adults did when they wanted children to like them, and telegraphed the wanting so clearly it had the opposite effect. He just sat still and let the boy look. Eli looked at him for a long time. Then he looked at Nora, and his mouth moved. No sound came out. But Nora went quiet, watching his face, reading it the way she had clearly been reading it for a long time. The face of a child who had stopped using words and started using everything else. "He wants to know if you're safe," Nora said. Caleb blinked. "Me?" "He wants to know if you're safe to be around." Nora looked at Caleb with those measuring eyes. "I told him yes, but he wants to see if I'm right." Caleb sat with that for a moment. Then he looked at Eli directly. "I reckon the only honest thing I can tell you is that I aim to keep you and your sister out of harm's way for as long as it takes. That's not the same as safe. Out here, this time of year, with the people who are after what you got, I can't promise safe." He paused. "But I can promise I'll put myself between you and the trouble before I let it get to you. That's the best offer I got." Eli looked at him for another long moment. Then the boy reached out from under the blanket and put his small hand on top of Nora's where it rested on the bench. It was not directed at Caleb. It was a small, private movement between a brother and a sister. But it meant something. Caleb could see that it meant something in the way Nora's shoulders came down half an inch. Ruth set a bowl of broth on the table near Eli's bench and stepped back. "Small sips," she said to Nora. "You hear me? Small ones." Nora nodded and helped her brother sit up, and Caleb watched the two of them together. The careful, ancient efficiency of children who had learned to take care of each other, and felt the weight of Samuel's letter in his coat pocket, like a coal still carrying heat. The door opened, and Frank Dolan came in without knocking, which meant something was already wrong. He closed the door behind him and looked at Caleb, and his expression was the expression of a man who had been given a piece of information he didn't want and was now responsible for it. "Grove went straight to my office from here," Dolan said. He kept his voice low with his back to the children. "Filed a formal petition for emergency guardianship. Says the children are in an unstable situation. Says you got no legal standing, Caleb." And he's right about that. Dolan's jaw was tight. "Alderman Circuit comes through Granger in 3 weeks. Grove knows the timing. He's filing now so the judge has the petition before he rides in." 3 weeks, Caleb said. 3 weeks before a hearing. In the meantime, Grove is technically within his rights to request the children be placed in neutral custody. He hasn't done that yet, but he can. Why hasn't he? Dolan was quiet for a moment. My read? He doesn't want to spook them into running before the hearing. He wants them here, contained, visible. He wants to walk into that courtroom with the children in the territory and his petition already filed, and the judge looking at a clean, simple family matter. "It ain't a family matter," Ruth said from behind the counter. "I know that," Dolan said. "But it'll look like one on paper, unless somebody puts something in front of Judge Alderman that makes it look like something else." He looked at Caleb. "You got anything?" "Samuel's letter," Caleb said. "The deed and the children's names. And a 9-year-old girl who'll tell you straight out that her mother was running from that man." "A letter from a dead man and the testimony of a minor," Dolan said. It was not dismissive. It was the flat, tired assessment of a man who had sat in enough territorial courtrooms to know how things landed. "It's something. It ain't enough." "Then I'll find enough," Caleb said. Dolan looked at him for a long moment. In that look was something complicated. The hesitation of a man who wanted to do the right thing and wasn't entirely certain what the right thing was, which was not cowardice, but was not courage either. It was the permanent condition of a man who had made the rules his god, because rules didn't ask you to be brave, only to be correct. "Grove's got money, and he's got time," Dolan said finally. "You got 3 weeks and whatever's in that bag." He put his hat on. I'll ride out with you this afternoon for the mother." He said it quietly. She deserves that much. After Dolan left, the room was quiet for a while. Eli had finished half the broth and fallen back into sleep. The real sleep this time. The restoring kind. Nora sat beside him and did not speak. Caleb stood at the window and looked at the street. Grove's black horse was still tied outside the boarding house across the way. The man himself was not visible, but that meant nothing. Patient men were rarely visible. They were present without being seen, the way cold was present in a room before you found the gap in the wall where it was coming from. Caleb thought about 3 weeks. About a territorial judge who had never met either of these children and would walk into a courtroom and see a wealthy, polished businessman on one side and a disgraced Pinkerton on the other, and be asked to decide which one deserved those children. He thought about Samuel Ashford's letter. He thought about the truth he was carrying in his coat pocket and had not yet told, and did not yet know how to tell. "Caleb," Nora said. He turned. She was still beside her brother, her hand resting on the blanket over Eli's arm. But she was looking at Caleb with those old, gray-blue eyes, and in them was something he had not seen there before. Not quite fear, not quite trust, but the particular, fragile thing that existed in the space between those two when a child was deciding which direction to fall. "What are we going to do?" she asked. Caleb looked at this girl, who was Samuel Ashford's daughter and Margaret Ashford's legacy, and the reason he had stopped running. And he said the only true thing there was to say. "We're going to fight," he said. "And we're going to win." Nora held his gaze. "You sound sure." "I am sure." "How?" Caleb looked at the boarding house across the street, at the black horse tied out front, at the town of Granger going about its winter business in the cold, clear morning. "Because that man over there thinks this is about land and money and law," he said. "And it ain't." He turned back to her. "It's about you and your brother. And I have found, in my experience, that a man fighting for money loses to a man fighting for something that actually matters." Nora was quiet for a long moment. Then she looked back at her brother, and her hand on the blanket tightened slightly. "Okay," she said. "Then we fight." They buried Margaret Ashford the following afternoon. Caleb and Dolan rode out together, pulling a small, flat sled behind Dolan's horse, with a pine box that Hector Greer at the lumber yard had put together that morning, without being asked and without charging for it, which was the kind of thing people did in small towns when they wanted to say something they didn't have words for. The storm had fully cleared, and the sky was the hard, brilliant blue that Wyoming produced in winter, like a proof of itself. And the cold was the kind that got into your lungs when you breathed, and reminded you that the world did not adjust its temperature for grief. Nora had asked to come. Caleb had looked at her for a long moment when she asked it, and he had not said no. Because she was 9 years old, and her mother was dead, and she had the right to say goodbye in whatever way she needed to say it. And deciding that for her would have been the worst kind of condescension, the kind dressed up as protection. He had said yes. Ruth had bundled both children into every available layer, and Eli had stood very still while Ruth wrapped a scarf around his face and had looked at Caleb over the top of it with those dark, steady eyes that gave nothing away and took everything in. Eli had not spoken, but he had walked out to the horses without being carried, which was the first time he had moved under his own power since Caleb pulled him from the wagon. And Caleb had noted it, the way you noted a thing that mattered, without making a performance of noticing it. The draw looked smaller in the daylight. Things always did. The places where the worst things happened had a way of shrinking down to their actual dimensions once the darkness and the fear were gone. They became just places, just ground, just geography with an event attached to it that the ground itself had already forgotten. Dolan handled most of the physical work. He was a man who moved with purpose when the task was clear, and the task here was clear. Caleb stood back with the children while Dolan worked, and Nora stood straight back beside him with her hands at her sides and watched everything and did not cry. And Eli stood on Caleb's other side and pressed his shoulder against Caleb's arm and kept it there. Caleb let him. When it was done, Dolan stepped back and took off his hat and looked at Caleb, which meant the words, if there were going to be words, were Caleb's responsibility. Caleb was not a man who prayed anymore. He had stopped somewhere around the 3rd year of Pinkerton work, when he had seen enough of what people did to each other to make the architecture of a caring God feel structurally unsound. But he knew how to speak to the dead, because the dead were not asking for theology. They were just asking to be acknowledged. He took off his hat. He looked at the ground. "Margaret Ashford," he said, "you did right by your children. You kept them alive when most people wouldn't have known how. You made decisions under conditions that would have broken stronger people, and they didn't break you." He paused. "They're safe. Both of them. I give you my word on that." Nora's hand found his. Small fingers, cold even through her mittens, wrapping around his without asking permission. He held on. Eli made a sound. It was not a word. It was a low, sustained note from somewhere in the boy's chest. Not musical exactly, more like the sound a person made when they were trying to push something out that had been compressed too long. It lasted maybe 4 seconds. Then it stopped. Nobody said anything about it, but Dolan, who was not a particularly observant man about most things, glanced at Eli with something that was not quite surprise and not quite relief, and then looked away quickly, the way you looked away from something private that you'd accidentally witnessed. On the ride back, Eli fell asleep against Caleb's chest, the same way he had the morning before, his face turned in, his breathing slowing within minutes. Nora rode behind Caleb again, her hands in his jacket, and she was quiet for almost a mile before she spoke. "She would have liked you," Nora said. Caleb kept his eyes on the trail. "How do you know that?" "Because you didn't tell me not to come today." She hated when people decided things for her that were hers to decide. A pause. She said the most disrespectful thing one person could do to another was assume they couldn't handle their own life. She was right about that. She was right about most things, Nora said. Not everything, but most things. They came back into Granger as the light was going amber and long, the particular late afternoon light of a short winter day that seemed to be apologizing for leaving so soon. Ruth had kept the eating house warm, and there was cornbread on the table. And Eli woke when Caleb brought him inside and looked at the cornbread with an expression that was the closest thing to ordinary that Caleb had seen on the boy's face. "Eat," Caleb told him. "Slow, like Ruth said." Eli looked at the cornbread. He looked at Caleb. He picked up the piece in front of him and took a bite that was, in point of fact, not particularly slow. Ruth, watching from behind the counter, pressed her lips together over something that was trying to be a smile. It was the first normal moment in 3 days, and it lasted about 40 minutes, which was roughly how long it took Harland Grove to send his first message. It came through Reverend Stanton, which was either a calculated choice or a genuinely low thing, and Caleb suspected it was both. The Reverend was a tall, thin man of 65, who had the look of someone who had been gradually consumed by his own conscience over the course of several decades, leaving mostly skeleton and sincerity. He came into Ruth's just as the children were finishing eating, and he came in with his hat already in his hands, which meant he knew he was not entirely welcome and wanted to acknowledge it up front. "Caleb," he said, "a word, if you don't mind." They stepped out onto the porch. The cold hit immediately, the temperature having dropped another 10 degrees since sunset. Caleb pulled the door mostly closed behind him. "Grove came to see me," Stanton said. He was not a man who prevaricated, which Caleb had always appreciated about him. "This afternoon, after you rode out." "What did he want?" "He made an offer." Stanton's jaw tightened slightly. "He said if you would agree to step away from the children voluntarily, he would withdraw the petition for emergency custody and allow the standard hearing to proceed. He said it would be better for everyone, especially the children, if this was handled quietly." "He say what quietly meant?" "He implied it meant without the level of conflict and public attention that a contested hearing would generate." Stanton paused. "He said contested hearings were hard on children." "He's worried," Caleb said. Stanton looked at him. Why would he be worried? He has the law on his side. "He has the letter of the law on his side," Caleb said. "There's a difference. And he knows what's in Samuel's bag. He knows I've read it. He's making offers because he'd rather not put any of this in front of a judge if he can avoid it." He leaned against the porch rail and looked at the street. "What did you tell him?" "I told him I would pass along his message." Stanton was quiet for a moment. "Caleb, I have to ask you something." "Then ask it." "What is your stake in this? These children aren't yours. You found them in a snowbank. Any decent man would have done the same, brought them in, seen them warm, handed them over to proper authority. You've gone considerably beyond that." He paused. "I'm not criticizing. I'm trying to understand." Caleb said nothing for a long moment. The cold worked at the back of his neck. Somewhere down the street, a horse stamped in the livery. "Their father is dead," Caleb said finally. "Their mother is dead. They've got one living blood relation, and he's the reason their mother was running in a blizzard in December." He looked at Stanton. "You tell me what proper authority looks like in that situation." Stanton held his gaze. "You know something," he said, "about the father, about how he died." "Joel." "I've known you 2 years, Caleb. I know what a man looks like when he's carrying a specific weight, as opposed to a general one." The Reverend's voice was not accusatory. It was pastoral, which was almost worse. "You came to me the first week you were in Granger. You told me you had done something that could not be undone, and you were trying to figure out if men like you had any road back." "I remember." "I told you I didn't know. I told you I believed action was the answer to that question more than any words I could offer." He paused. "Is this the action?" The question sat in the cold air between them and did not go away. "Maybe," Caleb said. Stanton put his hat back on. "Then do it right," he said. "Whatever you're carrying, do not let it become a reason to make mistakes." He started down the steps. And don't underestimate Grove. He did not get to where he is by being wrong about people. Caleb went back inside. Nora was at the table with Ruth's stub of a pencil and a piece of brown paper from the counter, drawing. She drew the way she apparently did everything. Focused, economical, no wasted movement. Caleb stood behind her and looked at the paper without meaning to, and then could not look away. Because what she was drawing was her mother's face. Not from imagination, from memory. Which meant she had her mother's face so precisely catalogued inside her head that she could reproduce it freehand on rough paper with a dull pencil. And the face on the paper was gentle and tired and real in the way that only drawings made from grief were real. Because grief was the most accurate lens available. He looked away before she noticed him looking. Eli was asleep again on the bench, Ruth's blanket pulled up to his chin. The boy was sleeping more than he was awake, which Ruth said was right and expected. The body repaying a debt that had been building for days. He would sleep and he would eat when he was awake, and in a few more days he would start to be a child again, rather than a small body working its way back from the edge. Caleb sat down across from Nora at the table. She did not look up from her drawing. Grove sent someone to talk to you. Reverend Stanton. What did he want? He wants me to step away. Nora's pencil stopped. She looked up. Are you going to? No. She looked at him for a moment. Then she went back to drawing. Good, she said. Nora, I need to talk to you about something. She looked up again, and this time there was something in her face that was different. A slight adjustment, a readying. The expression of a child who had learned that when adults began sentences with, I need to talk to you, what followed was generally something she needed to brace for. The land deed, Caleb said. I need you to tell me everything you know about it. Everything your mother told you. Where the land is, who holds the survey records, whether there was a lawyer involved in drawing it up. Nora set down the pencil. She folded her hands on the table. Papa filed it with a lawyer in Columbia, Missouri, she said. Mr. Theodore Birch. He sent Mama a copy when Papa died. Said the original was on record with the Territorial Land Office in Denver. She paused. Mama kept the copy in the leather folder, the one in her bag. I have it, Caleb said. It's in the bag. Grove knows it's there too, Nora said. Yes. He's going to try to say it isn't valid, or that we aren't who we say we are, or that Papa wasn't in his right mind when he signed it. She said this with the flat precision of a child recounting something she had heard discussed many times, in the way that children absorbed adult conversations they were not meant to be part of. Mama said that was what he would do. She said rich men didn't need to steal things directly. They just made the paperwork complicated until the other person couldn't keep up. Your mama was a smart woman. I already told you that, Nora said, and there was the faintest edge of something in her voice. Not quite impatience, more like the mild correction of someone who did not need a thing confirmed that they had already stated as fact. Caleb almost smiled. You did, he said. What do we need, she asked, to win? What exactly do we need? He looked at her. 9 years old and asking the question like she was preparing to go do the work herself if the answer required it. He thought about what Dolan had said. He thought about 3 weeks and a circuit judge who didn't know any of them. He thought about what a territorial courtroom looked like from the outside. A rich man in a good coat and a drifter with a past, and 2 children in the middle. We need witnesses, Caleb said. People in this town who've seen me with you and Eli. People who can say what they saw honestly. He paused. We need the lawyer in Columbia to confirm the deed is legitimate and on record. That means a telegram. He paused again. And we need something that shows Grove is not what he's presenting himself to be. Mama said he killed Papa, Nora said. I know she did. But a mother's word through a dead woman's letter isn't evidence. Not the kind that holds up. He kept his voice straight and level. We need something that connects Grove to a pattern. Something a judge can't look away from. Nora was quiet for a moment. She picked up the pencil and turned it in her fingers without writing anything. There was a woman, she said slowly, before Mama and Papa were married. A woman Grove was engaged to. She died. She frowned slightly at the memory. Mama mentioned her once, when she was explaining to me why we couldn't trust Harland. She said the woman had money, and Grove had been going to marry her for it. And then she died before the wedding, and somehow the money ended up with Grove anyway. Nora looked up. I don't remember her name. I was little. That might be enough to start with, Caleb said. He stood and went to the counter where the bag was. He pulled out Samuel's letter again and read it through one more time, looking for anything he had missed the first 2 readings. On the third pass, something snagged his attention that hadn't landed before. Near the end, after the instructions about running west, Samuel had written 4 words that Caleb had read as general warning, and now read differently. Ask Birch about Eliza. He had not read it carefully enough the first time. He read it 3 more times now, each time more certain. Birch was the lawyer in Columbia, and Eliza was a name. He turned to Ruth. "I need to send a telegram." "Post office opens at 7, Ruth said. "Garrett Finch runs it. He's discreet when you ask him to be, and he'll be less discreet the moment Grove puts money in front of him. So go early and go specific." Caleb nodded. He folded the letter and put it in his coat. "Caleb," Ruth said. Her voice was low, the register she used when the children weren't meant to hear. She was looking at him steadily from behind the counter, with the expression she got when she had been turning something over in her mind for a while, and had finally decided it was time to put it on the table. "I need to ask you something straight." "Then ask it straight." "Grove came to see me, too, not just Stanton." She watched his face. "This afternoon, while you were out at the draw. He came in very polite, ordered coffee, sat at the counter. And then he told me something interesting." Caleb waited. "He said you used to be a Pinkerton detective, that you were dismissed for cause, that before you left Missouri, you were involved in the death of a man." She paused. "He said the man's name was Samuel Ashford." The room was very quiet. Nora was still at the table with her pencil. She had gone very still. Caleb looked at Ruth. He did not look at Nora. He could not look at Nora. Not yet. Not for this exact moment, while he was deciding what to say and how to say it, and whether there was any version of the next 60 seconds that did not require a thing he was not ready for. "Is it true?" Ruth asked. "Yes," Caleb said. The word was not loud. It did not need to be. It dropped into the room the way heavy things dropped, not with noise, but with weight. Ruth's face did not change. She had the quality of a woman who had prepared herself for a range of answers, and this one was within the range. "Then you better tell me the rest of it," she said, "because Grove knows it, and if Grove knows it, it goes in front of that judge. And if it goes in front of that judge before you've dealt with it yourself, it ends this." Caleb turned. Nora was looking at him. She had turned in her chair, and she was looking at him directly, her pencil held still in her fingers, her face doing the thing it did when it was preparing itself for impact. Not flinching, not fleeing, just going very still the way still things went still. But her eyes were different now. They were searching. They were moving across his face the way eyes moved when they were looking for a thing they hoped was not there and were increasingly afraid it was. "Nora," Caleb said. "Samuel Ashford," she said slowly. The name in her mouth was careful, deliberate, each syllable separate. "That was my papa's name." Caleb pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. He put his hands on the table. He held her gaze. He had been rehearsing this moment in the back of his head since the afternoon he had found Samuel's name in the Bible in her mother's bag. He had thought about the right words, the right order, the right way to say the thing that could not be said in a right way. He had decided, and undecided, a dozen times whether to tell her at all, whether to carry it alone, whether knowing the truth served her or only served his own need to stop holding it. But Grove had taken the decision out of his hands, and that was possibly the first useful thing Grove had done. "The night your father died," Caleb said, "I was the man on that road." The silence that followed was not short. Nora did not move. She did not blink. Her face had gone to the particular stillness of someone receiving news that reorganizes everything they thought they understood about the room they were standing in. "You shot my papa," she said. "Yes." "You didn't know who he was?" "No. I thought he was a man I was following. I was wrong." He kept his voice level, and he kept his hands flat on the table. "I have known since the afternoon I found your mother's Bible that Samuel Ashford was your father. I have been carrying that since then." "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because your brother had a fever that might have killed him, and your mother was dead in a snowbank, and you were 9 years old and alone," Caleb said. "I didn't tell you because the timing was wrong." "And now?" "Now Grove is using it as a weapon, and I would rather you hear it from me." Nora was quiet for a long time, long enough that Caleb heard Ruth set something down softly behind the counter and move to the back room and close the door, giving them the only kind of privacy the space allowed. Long enough that Eli shifted on the bench in his sleep and made a small sound and stilled again. Long enough that the fire popped twice and the lamp on the counter flickered in a draft from somewhere. And Caleb sat without moving and let her take whatever time she needed, because time was the only thing he could give her right now that cost him nothing. "My mama said it was an accident," Nora said finally. "It was. She said the man didn't know." "I didn't know." "She said—" Nora stopped. She set the pencil down on the table. She looked at her hands. "She said holding on to who it was wouldn't bring Papa back." Her voice was very careful. "She said it would just give the grief somewhere to live." "Your mother was right," Caleb said. Nora looked up. Her eyes were bright and they were steady. She was not crying. She did not look like she was about to cry. She looked like someone standing at the edge of a very large decision, looking out at the space in front of them, deciding whether to step off or step back. "Did you know?" she asked. "When you pulled us out of the wagon, when you carried Eli, when you brought us here." Her voice was controlled in a way that was almost frightening in a 9-year-old. "Did you know then who we were?" "No," Caleb said. "I found out when I went back for your mother's bag." "So you didn't come find us because of guilt?" "No." "You just found us?" "Yes." Nora looked at the table. She looked at her drawing of her mother's face. She picked it up and looked at it for a long time. "Mama would have thought this was something," she said quietly. "That out of everyone in the territory, you were the one who found us." She was speaking carefully, almost to herself. "She used to say that life didn't make accidents the way people thought it did. That things happened for reasons that only made sense from the other side." She set the drawing back down. "I don't know if I believe that." "Neither do I," Caleb said. "But you stayed anyway, even after you knew." "Yes." "Why?" And there it was, the question that all the other questions had been building toward, the one underneath everything. He could have given her the answer about it being the right thing to do. He could have given her the answer about responsibility and debt. Both would have been true, and neither would have been the real answer. "Because your father's letter asked your mother to find someone honest," Caleb said. "And I have not been honest enough in my life, about enough things, to let that letter go unanswered." He paused. "And because you and Eli are here, and you needed someone, and I was the someone who was there." Nora looked at him for a long time. Then she picked up her pencil. "Okay," she said. Caleb looked at her. "Okay?" "I'm not saying it's okay," she said, with a precision that was entirely her mother's. "I'm saying I heard you, and I'm saying I need to think about it." She looked at the paper, "And I'm saying that right now, with Harland Grove across the street, and 3 weeks until a judge comes, thinking about it has to wait." She looked up. "So, the telegram. What are you going to say to Mr. Birch?" Caleb looked at this girl, who had just been handed one of the hardest things a child could be handed, and had folded it into her pocket to deal with later, because later was the only time she could afford. And he felt something in his chest that he did not have a clean name for. Not pride, because she wasn't his to be proud of. Not relief, because nothing was resolved. Just the particular weight of being in the presence of someone who was stronger than the circumstances that were trying to break them. "I'm going to ask him about Eliza," Caleb said. Nora's eyes sharpened. "That name was in Papa's letter." "Yes." "You think it matters?" "I think Samuel thought it mattered enough to put it in the last letter he ever wrote," Caleb said. "So yes, I think it matters." Nora nodded once. She looked at the door, then she looked at the window. Then she looked back at Caleb. "He's watching," she said. "Grove, he sent Stanton. He sent someone to talk to Ruth, and now he's watching." She said it without fear, with the flat, analytical attention of a child who had learned to read threat the way other children learn to read weather. "He wants to see if you'll run." "I know." "Will you?" Caleb looked at the door, at the window, at the boarding house across the street where a patient man in a good coat was waiting. "No," he said. Nora looked at her drawing one more time. Then she turned it over, face down on the table, and picked up the pencil. "Then tell me what you need me to do," she said. "I'm done sitting still." The telegraph office opened at 7, and Caleb was there at 5 past, standing in the cold with his breath making small clouds in the still morning air, while Garrett Finch worked the lock with fingers that moved slowly in the cold. Finch was 50, spare, with the careful, neutral expression of a man who had spent 20 years reading other people's private words and had learned that the safest relationship with information was one of complete detachment. He read the messages he sent and received the way a postal worker handled letters, as objects, not as meaning. Caleb had always found this quality useful. This morning, he found it essential. "Need to send 2, Caleb said. "Both marked urgent." Finch settled behind his counter and opened his ledger. "Rates are standard. Urgent is double." "I know." Caleb pulled the paper from his coat pocket. He had written both messages the night before by lamplight while the children slept, working through the words until they were as tight and specific as he could make them. The first was to Theodore Birch at his office address in Columbia, Missouri. The second was to the Bureau of Land Management's territorial office in Denver. He handed them across the counter. Finch read them both without any change of expression. "Denver will respond within a day if they have the file," he said. "Columbia depends on whether your lawyer is in his office. Could be 3 days, could be a week." "I need Columbia inside of 2 days." Finch looked at him over the top of the paper. "You want me to mark it urgent? There's a way to do that. Costs more." "Mark it." He paid and walked back to Ruth's in the thin, early light. Past the boarding house, where Grove's curtains were still drawn. Past the general store, where Tommy Briggs was already sweeping the steps and watched Caleb go by, with a particular alertness of a 13-year-old who understood that something large was happening around him, and was filing everything away for later examination. Ruth had coffee on the table when he came through the door. Nora was already up, sitting beside Eli's bench with a piece of cornbread broken into small pieces that she was feeding to him, one fragment at a time, with the patience of someone who had been told slow and intended to honor it. Eli was upright, which was new. He was sitting with his back against the wall and his knees pulled up, and he was eating each piece of cornbread with the grave, deliberate attention of a child who had recently rediscovered that food was real and was not taking that for granted. He looked at Caleb when the door opened. Caleb nodded at him. "Morning." Eli looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked back at the cornbread. It was not unfriendly. It was just Eli, complete and internal, watching the world from a place slightly behind his own eyes where he had retreated when the worst things happened, and from which he was only now beginning, carefully, to re-emerge. "Telegram sent," Caleb told Nora. She looked up. "Both?" Both. How long? Denver, maybe a day. Columbia, longer. We should hear from Birch by Thursday, if we're lucky. Nora nodded and broke another piece of cornbread and held it out to her brother. And if we're not lucky? Then we use what we have and we make it enough. Ruth set a plate in front of him without being asked. He ate standing at the counter because sitting felt wrong. Felt like settling into something when everything in him was still oriented outward, still watching the door and the window and the street beyond. Grove was at the boarding house porch at 6 this morning, Ruth said. She was at the stove, with her back to him, her voice even and informational. I saw him from my upstairs window, standing there in his coat, looking up the street, like a man who's done all his planning and is now just waiting for the clock. He's trying to rattle me, Caleb said. Is it working? Some. Ruth turned and looked at him. Good. A man who claims nothing rattles him is a man who ain't paying attention. Frank Dolan came in at 8:30, with his hat in his hands, and the look of a man who had slept badly and woken up to news he didn't want. He stood just inside the door and looked at Caleb, and then at the children, and then back at Caleb. My office, he said, when you have a minute. I have a minute now. Nora's eyes followed them to the door. Caleb caught her gaze on the way out and gave her a small nod that meant, stay put, and I will be back. And she received it with a particular expression she had for receiving information she was complying with under protest. The cold outside was harder than the morning before, a dry, bone-deep cold that got through clothing faster than wet cold did. They stood on the porch of the eating house, rather than walking to Dolan's office, because Caleb wanted to keep the door in his sightline. Grove filed additional documentation with me this morning, Dolan said. He was turning his hat in his hands, which he did when he was uncomfortable. Affidavit from a doctor in Kansas City states that Samuel Ashford was of diminished mental capacity in the last year of his life due to chronic intoxication. He paused. If that holds up, it puts the validity of the deed in question. Samuel filed that deed in 1874, Caleb said. Man wasn't a drunk in 1874. I know, but Grove's argument is that the deed should be examined in the context of the man's overall competence. Dolan's jaw was tight. Caleb, I need to be straight with you. Grove's lawyer is good. He's been building this thing in layers, and every layer he adds makes it harder to see the actual shape of what he's doing. He finally stopped turning the hat. He also filed something else. Caleb waited. Formal objection to your fitness as a temporary guardian. On the grounds of... Dolan stopped. Restarted. On the grounds of your involvement in the death of the children's father. There it was. Caleb had known it was coming. Knowing it was coming did not make the arrival easier. He's moving it to the hearing, Dolan continued. His lawyer is going to stand up in front of Judge Alderman and tell him that the man currently housing Samuel Ashford's children is the man who shot Samuel Ashford. He looked at Caleb directly. Tell me that ain't going to be a problem. It's going to be a problem, Caleb said. I won't lie to you about that. Then what's your answer to it? The truth, Caleb said. That it was an accident, that it was investigated and closed, that I left the work and the state immediately after, and that I have been transparent about it. He paused. And that Grove is the man who spent 6 months feeding Samuel Ashford whiskey until his liver gave out, which is a sight more deliberate than anything I did. Dolan was very quiet for a moment. You can prove that? I'm working on it. You've got 3 weeks, Caleb. I know how long I've got. Dolan put his hat on. He stood with his hand on the porch rail and looked at the street with the expression of a man who was doing the math on something and not liking where the numbers landed. Ruth McAllister's been talking to people, he said, quietly, asking around about what folks have seen since you brought those children in. She's got 8 or 9 people willing to speak to your character at the hearing." "I didn't ask her to do that." "No," Dolan said. "That's why it means something." He stepped off the porch. "Keep those children inside today. Grove's been asking questions around town about where they go and when. I don't like the feeling of it." Caleb watched him walk away, and then stood alone on the porch for a moment, with a cold working at his face. He thought about the hearing. He thought about what it would look like. Caleb Horn, former Pinkerton, dismissed for cause, killer of the children's father, standing up in front of a territorial judge and asking to keep 2 children who weren't his. He thought about Grove across the street, with his good coat and his assembled paperwork, and his patience that did not wear down. He thought about Nora saying, "I'm done sitting still." He went back inside. The day passed in the particular suspended way of days when the thing you are waiting for has not yet arrived, and all you can do is stay ready. Ruth kept the fire high and the door locked, and found small tasks to give the children that kept their hands busy. Nora helping sort dried beans at the counter. Eli sitting at the table with a piece of paper and the stub pencil, drawing what turned out to be horses, competent horses with good proportions that surprised Caleb when he looked over the boy's shoulder in the afternoon. "You draw," Caleb said. Eli looked up at him. He looked back at the drawing. He picked up the pencil and added a detail to the nearest horse's mane with 2 quick strokes. "He's been drawing since he could hold a pencil," Nora said from the counter. "Papa taught him. Said a man who could draw what he saw would always understand the world better than a man who could only describe it." Caleb looked at the horses on the paper. Samuel Ashford had taught his son to draw. Samuel Ashford had written a letter to protect his children. Samuel Ashford had filed a land deed in his children's names and died before he could see it matter. The man he had killed on that Missouri road had been someone's father in the fullest and most ordinary sense of the word, and Caleb had known that abstractly since the night it happened. But sitting in Ruth McAllister's eating house, watching Eli add 1 precise line to a horse's ear with a dull pencil, made it concrete in a way that abstraction never had. He looked away. Nora was watching him from the counter. She had been watching him at intervals all day, the way she watched everything. Not intrusively, not with accusation, just with the patient, calibrating attention of someone who was updating their understanding of a thing as new information came in. He did not know what conclusion she was reaching. He did not ask. She had said she needed to think about it. He was going to let her think. The response from Denver came the following morning. Finch sent Tommy Briggs with it, which meant Finch had read it and decided it was important enough to send immediately, rather than wait for Caleb to come in. Caleb read it at Ruth's counter while the children ate breakfast. The Denver office confirmed the deed. 412 acres, Colorado Territory, registered in the names of Nora Ashford and Eli Ashford, minors, filed in the spring of 1874. The registration was valid. The survey was on record. No liens, no subsequent filings, no contests on record as of the date of the telegram. Caleb folded it and put it in his coat. "Good news or bad?" Ruth asked. "The deed is clean," Caleb said. Nora looked up from her breakfast. "Grove can't take the land?" "Not directly, not through contesting the deed." Caleb sat down at the table. "What he can do is get guardianship, and as legal guardian he would manage the land until you and Eli are of age, which means he controls it without owning it, which for a man like Grove is close enough." "Then we have to stop the guardianship," Nora said. "Yes." "The telegram to Mr. Birch. If he answers about Eliza..." If Birch answers what I think he's going to answer, we give the judge a reason to look at Grove's history instead of just his paperwork. Caleb looked at her. A judge who's looking at a pattern isn't just looking at a custody petition. Nora was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What if Birch doesn't answer in time?" It was the question Caleb had been turning over since sending the telegram, and he had not yet arrived at a satisfactory answer, which was not a comfortable place for a man who had spent 10 years building cases on answers. "Then we stand up with what we have and we make it count," he said. Nora looked at him steadily. "That's the same thing you said 2 days ago." "It's still true 2 days later." She looked at her breakfast. "Okay," she said, not convinced exactly, but still in. The trouble arrived that afternoon in the form of a woman Caleb had not expected. She came in from the East Road, which was the direction of nothing useful. No major town, no rail connection, just 60 miles of open country before you hit anything worth calling civilization. She was perhaps 45, dark-haired, wearing a traveling coat that had been good quality once and had been worn hard. She tied her horse outside Ruth's and came through the door and looked around the room until her eyes found Nora. And when they found Nora, something crossed her face that was grief and relief and something else, tangled together so thoroughly they could not be separated. "Lord," the woman said, "you look just like your mother." Nora stood up from the table very slowly. "Who are you?" "My name is Clara Dent," the woman said. "I was your mother's cousin. We grew up together in Ohio." She looked at Eli on the bench, and the grief in her face sharpened. "I heard what happened. I've been writing 3 days." Ruth was behind the counter, and Caleb was on his feet, positioned between the woman and the children with a stillness that was not quite threatening, but was entirely intentional. "How did you know where to find them?" Caleb asked. Clara looked at him. She read his posture accurately, and something in her own posture responded to it. Not defensively, but with the particular honesty of someone who understood why the question was being asked and was not offended by it. "A man named Theodore Birch sent me a letter 2 weeks ago. Said Margaret had written to him before she died. Said she was heading west and things were bad, and if something happened, she wanted someone from her family to know." Clara's voice was steady, but her hands were not, clasped in front of her, the knuckles too white. "I got the letter after I'd already heard she was gone. A rider coming through mentioned it. I left the same day." "Birch," Caleb said. "You know him?" "I sent him a telegram 2 days ago." Something shifted in Clara's expression. "Then you'll likely hear from him directly. He's been—" She stopped. "He's been waiting to hear that these children were safe. Margaret trusted him with things. Important things." She looked at Nora. Things she didn't trust to letters that could be read by the wrong people. Nora had not moved from her spot beside the table. She was looking at Clara with those measuring eyes, running the same calculation she ran on everyone. Not hostile, just thorough. "You knew my mama," Nora said. "Since we were younger than you are now," Clara said. "We were like sisters once. We lost touch when she married and moved to Missouri." Her voice dropped slightly. "I should have kept in touch better. I knew things were hard. I should have—" She stopped. "I'm sorry. That's not useful now." "No," Nora said. "It ain't." Clara looked at her, and something in the woman's face softened in a way that suggested she was recognizing Margaret in Nora's directness. "You sound like her," she said. "People keep saying that," Nora said. Caleb looked at Clara Dent for a long moment, reading what he could from what he saw. 10 years of fieldwork had left him with a particular capacity for reading people in first impressions that he trusted more than he trusted most things. What he read in Clara Dent was grief that was real, and exhaustion that was real, and a woman who had ridden 3 days across open country in December because a letter had arrived too late, and she was trying to do in death what she had not done in life. That was not the behavior of a planted agent. "Sit down," he said. "We'll get you something hot." Clara sat. Ruth, who had been watching the whole exchange from behind the counter with the quiet attention she brought to everything, poured coffee without being asked. Nora sat back down across from Clara and looked at her with the focused, patient attention of a child conducting an interview. "What did Mama tell Mr. Birch?" she asked. "That she didn't put in letters." Clara wrapped her hands around the coffee cup and was quiet for a moment, the quiet of someone deciding how much to say and in what order. "She told him about Harland Grove," she said. "About what Grove did to Samuel. Not just the whiskey, before that." She looked at Caleb. "You know about the woman? Eliza?" "I know the name," Caleb said. "I don't know the story yet." "Eliza Marsh," Clara said. "That was her name before she married. She was from a good family in St. Louis. She had money, real money, the kind that stayed in families for generations. She and Grove were engaged for almost 2 years. She paused. She died 6 weeks before the wedding. They said it was her heart. She was 31 years old. "And the money," Caleb said. "Grove had convinced her to put his name on several accounts. For the marriage," she said. "For practicality." Clara's voice had gone flat and careful. "After she died, the money was his legally." No one questioned it because he was so convincing in his grief. So genuinely, absolutely convincing. She looked at her coffee. Theodore Birch was Eliza Marsh's family lawyer. He handled her estate after she died. He always believed something was wrong, but he couldn't prove it, and the family was too shattered to pursue it. "Birch knew Grove," Caleb said. "Birch watched Grove for 20 years, Clara said. Watched him move from woman to woman, from opportunity to opportunity. Always patient, always pleasant, always ending up with more than he started with, and the person who had the more ending up dead or ruined." She looked at Caleb directly. When Margaret wrote to him about what happened to Samuel, about Grove coming after the children and the land, Birch told her he would do anything he could to help. That he'd been waiting for someone to give him a way to stop Grove that didn't end with him looking like a bitter old man with a grudge. The room was quiet for a moment, except for the fire. "Does Birch have documentation?" Caleb asked. "Anything that ties Grove to Eliza's death or the money?" "I don't know what he has," Clara said. "I know he's been keeping records for 20 years. I know he sent Margaret copies of things." She looked at Nora. "Your mama had papers, things Birch sent her over the years, things she never showed anyone." Nora went very still. "Mama's bag," she said. "The leather folder," Caleb said. Nora was already moving. She went to the counter where the bag sat and pulled out the leather folder and untied it. She spread the contents on the table: the land deed, Samuel's letter, the copies of registration documents. And then, beneath all of it, folded small and tucked into the fold of the folder itself, a sheaf of papers that Caleb had not opened because he had found what he was looking for and stopped looking. He unfolded them. They were copies. Copies of bank records, copies of correspondence, copies of affidavits signed by people Caleb did not recognize. At the top of the first page, in Theodore Birch's careful lawyer's hand, "For Margaret, in case of emergency. Do not show these to anyone who is not already fighting." Caleb read through them standing at the table, and as he read, the shape of what Grove had done over 20 years assembled itself, the way a landscape assembled itself at dawn. Not all at once, but gradually, each new detail adding dimension to what had been flat. Eliza Marsh's accounts, transferred to Grove's name 3 months before her death, with Grove's signature and Eliza's, witnessed by a notary who had died the following year. Correspondence between Grove and a doctor in St. Louis, dated the month before Eliza died, discussing a treatment that the doctor had not subsequently documented in Eliza's medical records. A letter from Grove to his own bank manager, written 2 weeks before the wedding, concerning the disposition of a significant sum that he expected to come into his possession shortly. And at the bottom of the sheaf, an affidavit from a woman named Alice Fenn, a former housemaid in the Marsh household, stating that, in the weeks before Eliza's death, she had seen Grove adding something to Eliza's morning tea. That she had not come forward at the time because she was afraid. That she was coming forward now because Alice Fenn was dying of something else entirely and had decided that fear was no longer a reason that held water. The affidavit was dated 3 years ago. It had been notarized. Caleb set it down. He looked at Nora. She was watching him read with her arms crossed and her chin slightly up, the posture of someone bracing for weather. "Is it enough?" she asked. "It's more than enough," Caleb said. "If Birch comes, and he'll come in person. That's what this means. We put all of this in front of Judge Alderman, and Grove doesn't just lose the guardianship petition." He paused. "He answers for Eliza Marsh." Clara Dent let out a long breath across the table. Nora unfolded her arms. She looked at the papers spread across Ruth's table. 20 years of a patient man's quiet destruction, assembled and documented and carried in the bottom of a dead woman's bag across the winter prairie. "Mama knew," she said. "She had all of this, and she was carrying it the whole time." "She was waiting for the moment it would do the most good," Clara said. "She died before that moment," Nora said. "No," Caleb said. Both women looked at him. He looked at Nora. "She got the papers to you. She got you here. She got you to a place where someone could use them." He paused. "Your mama didn't die before the right moment. She got it here, in the right hands. That's what she was doing the whole time." Nora looked at him for a long moment. Something moved in her face that she did not try to stop. A loosening. A brief and private grief that was also something else. Something that was not grief at all, but was relief. The particular relief of a thing being seen clearly for the first time. Then she straightened. She looked at the papers. She looked at Caleb. "We need to keep these safe," she said. "If Grove finds out what's in that folder—" "He won't find out," Ruth said from behind the counter, "because they won't be here." Everyone looked at her. Ruth came around the counter and picked up the papers with the calm efficiency of a woman who had already decided what to do. "I have a lockbox," she said, "under the floor in the back. My husband built it in 1861 because he didn't trust banks. It has held everything important I have owned for 15 years, and nobody in Granger knows it exists." She looked at Caleb. "Nobody." Caleb nodded. "Put them in." Ruth took the papers and went to the back room. The door closed. Eli, who had been sitting at the table through all of it, with his drawing and his quiet attention, looked up. He looked at Nora. He looked at Clara. He looked at Caleb. Then he set down his pencil, and in a voice that was small and rough and slightly uncertain, like an instrument that had not been played in a while, and was not entirely sure it still worked, Eli Ashford said, "Are we going to be okay?" The room went completely still. Nora made a sound that was not quite a word. She crossed the room and got down on her knees beside her brother's chair and put both arms around him and held on. And Eli, after a moment, put his arms around her back. Caleb stood at the table and looked at the floor, and did not trust himself to look anywhere else for a moment. Clara Dent pressed her hand over her mouth. After a while, Nora pulled back and looked at her brother's face. Her eyes were wet. She was smiling. "Yeah," she said. "We're going to be okay." She looked over her shoulder at Caleb. "Right?" Caleb looked at this boy who had not spoken in weeks, who had come back from the edge of something cold and permanent, and found his way back to words through all of this. And he looked at Nora, who was still on her knees beside her brother, with tears on her face, and the question in her eyes that was not really a question at all. "Right," he said. It was not a promise he could make with certainty. He knew that. Nora knew that. Even Eli, 6 years old and just now returned to language, probably knew that. But some things needed to be said anyway. Some things needed to be said because the people who needed to hear them had already been through enough uncertainty to last a lifetime. And certainty, even imperfect certainty, was worth something. Worth a great deal. Ruth came back out of the back room and looked at Eli, and the expression on her face was the expression of a woman who had seen enough of the world to know that small things were the large things, and this moment was one of the large ones. "Well," she said. She set her hands on her hips. "I reckon that calls for something better than cornbread." She turned to the stove. "Anybody here object to apple pie?" Eli looked at Nora. Nora looked at Caleb. "No objections," Caleb said. Outside, across the street, Grove's curtains were still. The patient man in the good coat was still waiting. In 11 days, Judge Alderman would ride into Granger on the circuit and walk into a room where two sides had been building their cases with everything they had. But in Ruth McAllister's eating house on a cold December afternoon, Eli Ashford had spoken for the first time in weeks, and the papers that could end Harland Grove were locked under the floor in a box that nobody knew existed. And Clara Dent was warming her hands on a coffee cup, and Nora Ashford was sitting beside her brother with her hand over his, and her eyes still bright from crying. And Caleb Horn, who had ridden west to outrun the worst thing he had ever done, and had instead ridden directly into its consequences, was standing in the middle of all of it, with something in his chest that he had not felt in 4 years. It was not peace. It was not absolution. It was purpose, plain and specific, and his. And for now, that was enough. Theodore Birch arrived on the 10th day. Caleb saw him coming from the porch of Ruth's eating house, a small man on a big horse, wrapped in a coat that had been made for a larger climate and was not adequate for Wyoming in December, riding with a determined, slightly miserable posture of someone who had decided to do a thing and was going to finish doing it, regardless of what the weather had to say about it. He was perhaps 65, white-haired, with a kind of face that had been built for precision, sharp eyes behind wire spectacles, a mouth that looked like it had spent decades choosing words carefully and was not about to stop now. He tied his horse outside Ruth's and looked up at Caleb on the porch and said, "You're Horn." "I am," Caleb said. "Theodore Birch." He came up the steps and extended his hand and shook with the firm, brief grip of a man who had shaken a great many hands over a great many decades, and had stopped trying to communicate anything through the gesture beyond basic respect. "I got your telegram. I was already packed. Come inside." Nora looked up from the table when they came through the door, and something in her face shifted. Not quite recognition, because she had never met this man, but the recognition of a name made suddenly real. "Mr. Birch," she said. Birch stopped when he saw her. He looked at her for a long moment, with an expression that was careful and a little pained. The expression of a man seeing something he had hoped to see for a long time, and finding it both better and harder than he expected. "You look like your mother," he said. "I know," Nora said. "Everybody says so." "It's a compliment of the highest order," Birch said quietly. He looked at Eli beside her, and something in his jaw tightened briefly and released. "And this is Eli." Eli looked at him. He did not speak, but he had spoken twice more in the days since the first time. Small, careful sentences, each one retrieved from somewhere it had been locked away and brought back out into the light with visible effort. The speaking was returning the way feeling returned to a cold limb, slowly and with some discomfort, but returning. "Sit down," Ruth said from behind the counter. "Both of you." Birch sat. Caleb sat across from him. Nora stayed at the table because Nora was done being told to stay elsewhere, and Caleb had stopped trying, because she was right that it was her business and wrong to be excluded from it. "I've been watching Harland Grove for 22 years, Birch said. He said it without preamble, without the setup that lesser men use to make themselves seem more significant than the story they were telling. "I watched him with Eliza Marsh. I watched him after. I have watched him move through this territory and the ones adjacent to it like a slow fire, leaving just enough ash to be suspicious and not enough to be provable." He set his hands flat on the table. "Margaret Ashford gave me the opening I needed, and now I am here to use it." "The papers Ruth is holding," Caleb said. "Alice Fenn's affidavit." "Alice died 8 months ago," Birch said. "But an affidavit properly notarized does not die with the person who gave it. It is a legal document, and it stands." He reached into his coat and produced his own leather folder, thicker than Samuel's, worn at the corners from years of handling. "I have the originals of everything Margaret had copies of. I have additional documentation she did not have. And I have arranged for 2 witnesses to ride in for the hearing. Men who did business with Grove in Kansas City and found the experience educational in ways they are prepared to describe under oath." Caleb looked at the folder. "You've been building this for a long time." 22 years is a long time, Birch agreed. "Long enough that I stopped thinking of it as building and started thinking of it as waiting. Waiting for the right moment, the right venue, the right person on the other side of the table who was willing to stand up and not sit back down." He looked at Caleb directly. "That's you, Mr. Horn." "I'm a disgraced Pinkerton who shot these children's father by mistake," Caleb said. He said it flat and plain, because there was no useful version of this conversation that did not have that fact in the middle of it. "Yes," Birch said, "I know." He did not flinch from it. "I also know the investigation that followed found no criminal negligence. I know you resigned immediately and left the state. I know that in the 4 years since, you have not been in any further trouble with any law in any territory." He paused. "Grove's lawyer is going to stand up in that courtroom and make what you did the centerpiece of his argument. He's going to make it look like the children are in danger from you." He paused again. "My job is to make sure that by the time he does that, the judge is already looking at Grove so hard that the argument lands in empty air." The night before the hearing, Caleb could not sleep. He sat on the porch of his own cabin for the first time in 10 days, having ridden out alone in the dark because he needed the particular silence of a place where no one was watching him, and no one needed anything from him for 1 hour. The children were safe at Ruth's, with Clara keeping watch, and Birch was at the boarding house on the opposite end of town from Grove, and Dolan had his office lamp burning late. The stars were very clear and very cold and very indifferent, the way they always were, the way Caleb had always found both aggravating and stabilizing, the universe's refusal to assign significance to any particular human difficulty. He thought about Samuel Ashford. He had been thinking about Samuel Ashford in the abstract for 4 years, as a weight, as a fact, as the thing that had ended one version of his life and begun another. He had never been able to think about him as a person, because thinking about him as a person required knowing who he was, and knowing who he was required exactly the kind of proximity that Caleb had spent 4 years avoiding. Now he knew. Samuel Ashford had taught his son to draw horses. Samuel Ashford had married a woman who could move mountains without raising her voice. Samuel Ashford had filed a land deed in his children's names because he understood that the best thing a man could do for his children was make sure the world had less leverage over them after he was gone. Samuel Ashford had been worth more than the mistake that had ended him. Caleb sat with that for a long time. He did not ask it to become something more comfortable than it was. He just sat with it, the way you sat with things that were true and heavy and not going anywhere. And after a while, he got back on his horse and rode back to Granger. When he came through Ruth's door, Nora was awake. She was sitting at the table with her drawing, her mother's face, which she had turned back over at some point and returned to, adding small, careful details in the lamplight. She looked up when he came in. "You couldn't sleep either," she said. "No." She looked at the drawing. "I keep making her nose wrong," she said. "I can see it perfectly in my head, and then when I put it down, it comes out different." Caleb sat across from her. He looked at the drawing. The face on the paper was recognizable, gentle, tired in the specific way of a woman who had carried a great deal for a long time. "Looks right to me," he said. "You didn't know her?" "No, but it looks like someone real." Nora was quiet for a moment. "Caleb?" "Yeah." She set the pencil down. She looked at him the way she had been looking at him all week, with that careful, updating attention, the expression of someone whose understanding of a thing was still being revised. "I've been thinking about what you told me, about Papa." "I know you have." "I'm not—" She stopped. "I don't forgive you," she said. "I don't think I can right now. I don't know if that changes." "That's fair," Caleb said. "But I also don't think—" She stopped again, the way she stopped when she was locating the precise words for something. "Mama said it was an accident, and I believe her. She didn't lie to me. Not about important things." She looked at the drawing. "And you've been here every day. You didn't have to stay. You could have brought us in and handed us to Dolan and ridden away, and nobody would have blamed you." "I would have blamed me," Caleb said. "I know," Nora said. "That's why you didn't." She picked up the pencil again. "I just needed you to know that I'm still thinking about it, that I haven't decided everything yet." "You don't have to decide everything yet," Caleb said. "You're 9 years old." "I'll be 10 in March." "Still." She almost smiled. The almost smile was something Caleb had catalogued over the past 10 days. The small, reluctant expression that appeared on Nora Ashford's face when something landed closer to funny than she had expected or wanted. It was, he had come to understand, her highest compliment. "Get some sleep," he said. "Tomorrow's going to be long." The hearing was held in the church because the church was the only building in Granger large enough to hold what turned out to be most of the town. Judge Alderman had ridden in the previous evening, a compact, weathered man of 55 who had the look of someone who had spent 30 years on the circuit and had seen enough of human nature to be surprised by very little of it. He had eaten supper at Ruth's, which Caleb thought was either a good sign or an irrelevant detail, and had said nothing about the case to anyone, which was as it should be. The room was full when Caleb arrived with the children. He had not expected it to be quite this full. Ruth's 8 or 9 people had apparently talked to other people, and those people had talked to others. And what had assembled itself in the pews of Granger's only church was a cross-section of the town that included the blacksmith and the livery owner and 3 ranch families from the surrounding land, and Tommy Briggs sitting in the back with his hat in his hands. Grove was already there, at the table to the left, with his lawyer, a man named Cutler, who had ridden in from Casper and looked like he had been assembled specifically for courtrooms. Everything about him was precise and without warmth. Grove sat straight-backed and composed, and looked at Caleb and the children when they came in, and did not look away until he chose to, which was the move of a man communicating that he did not feel threatened. Caleb sat down with the children at the table to the right, Birch beside him, Clara Dent in the front pew directly behind them. Nora sat with her hands folded. Eli sat beside her, with one hand on the table and one hand in his sister's, and he looked at the room with those dark, steady eyes and did not appear to be afraid, which was either genuine composure or the stillness of a child who had run out of room for new fear. Judge Alderman came in, and the room went quiet, and the hearing began. Cutler went first, and he was as good as Dolan had said he was, smooth and organized and relentlessly reasonable, building his case in the tone of a man explaining something that should have been obvious to everyone from the start. Blood relation, legal standing, resources and stability, the deed's questionable origins. And then, measured and deliberate, the matter of Caleb Horn, the man currently housing the children, and his connection to the death of their father. He was good. Caleb gave him that. When Birch stood, he was quiet for a moment before he said anything, the way certain men were quiet before they spoke, because they understood that silence asked for attention in a way that words did not. Then he began. He did not argue with Cutler's version of events. He did not raise his voice. He simply began introducing documents, one at a time, each one building on the one before, the way you built a structure that was meant to hold weight, not quickly, not dramatically, just solidly, piece by piece, until the shape of it was undeniable. Alice Fenn's affidavit, the bank transfers before Eliza Marsh's death, the letter to the bank manager, the doctor's correspondence, the testimony of the two men from Kansas City, who stood up in succession and described their professional dealings with Grove in the flat, specific language of men who had been defrauded and had never forgotten the details. Grove's lawyer objected frequently. Alderman overruled most of it. Halfway through, Caleb watched something change in the room. It was subtle, a shift in the quality of attention, the way people leaned slightly forward, the way the air in the space went from curious to something more engaged, more troubled. The people of Granger were understanding what they were looking at, and what they were looking at was not a custody dispute. It was 22 years of a careful man destroying everyone around him for profit, assembled into a record that made the shape of it visible for the first time. Grove's face did not change. He sat with that composed expression, and Caleb watched his hands, because hands were harder to control than faces, and Grove's hands on the table in front of him had gone very still in the particular way of hands that were being deliberately kept still. Birch called Caleb to the stand. Caleb stood and walked to the front and sat in the chair and looked at the room. He found Nora's face in it immediately. She was watching him with her arms at her sides and her chin slightly up and her eyes steady, and he held on to that. Birch asked him about finding the children, about what he had found in Margaret's bag, about what he had done since, and why. Caleb answered each question in the same way he had answered questions for 10 years of field work. Directly, without decoration, with a specific detail that made things real, and the restraint that kept sentiment from getting in the way of fact. Then Birch asked the question they had discussed the night before. "Mr. Horn, you have disclosed to this court that you were involved in the accidental death of Samuel Ashford 4 years ago. Why did you not leave these children in the care of the deputy marshal when you brought them in from the storm?" Caleb was quiet for a moment. "Because the deputy marshal would have sent a telegram to the only known family," he said. And the only known family was the man who had spent 6 months killing their father with expensive whiskey and had been following their mother across 3 states. He paused. "And because I found them. They were alive when they should have been dead. I was the person who was there. He looked at Alderman. I'm not a good man by any clean measure. I have made mistakes that cannot be undone. But I know what it means to fail someone when it counts, and I was not willing to hand those children to the man who was going to fail them on purpose. The room was very quiet. Cutler cross-examined hard. He went through Cedar Creek and the Pinkerton dismissal and the accident, and he built from those pieces the picture of an unstable, violent man with a pattern of failure, and he was good at it. And Caleb sat still and answered every question without deflecting, because deflecting would have been worse than the questions. When Cutler finished, Judge Alderman looked at Caleb. You understand, the judge said, that what you're asking this court to grant is not a small thing. Yes, sir. You are asking for guardianship of children who are not your blood relation, whose father you killed, whose mother you never met. Yes, sir. Why should I grant that? Caleb looked at the judge. He looked at Nora. He looked at Eli, who was watching him with those dark eyes that took everything in and gave nothing away. Because they've already been through enough, Caleb said. Because their mother rode 1,000 miles in winter to get them somewhere safe, and she did not survive the journey. And the least this court can do is honor what she was trying to accomplish. He paused. And because Harland Grove wants them for their land, and I want them because they are Nora and Eli, and they deserve someone who shows up every day just because they deserve to have someone show up every day. Alderman looked at him for a long moment. Then he turned to the room. I'll hear from the children. Cutler started to stand. Alderman held up one hand without looking at him, and Cutler sat back down. Nora walked to the front of the room on her own. She sat in the chair, and she was small in it, her feet not quite touching the floor. And she looked at the judge with those gray-blue eyes, and did not look away. You understand what's being decided today? Alderman asked her. Yes, sir. Where we go? Who takes care of us? Do you want to say anything to this court? Nora was quiet for a moment. She looked at Grove. She looked at him the way she had looked at him the first time he came into Ruth's, with the flat, careful attention of someone reading a threat. Then she looked at Alderman. My mama ran from that man, she said. She ran until she couldn't run anymore. She died in the snow trying to keep us out of his hands. I don't know much about law, but I know what my mama knew, and I know why she was running. And I know that what she died for shouldn't be undone in a church by a man in a good coat. She folded her hands in her lap. Caleb Horn found us when we were dying. He buried my mama proper, and he sat on the floor of Ruth McAllister's eating house all night, so he'd be there when we woke up. And he's been there every day since. That's not nothing. That's not nothing at all. She came back to the table and sat down and took Eli's hand. Eli looked at the judge. Then, in that small, rough voice that was still finding its way back to regular use, he said, Don't send us away. 3 words, perfectly chosen in the way that children sometimes chose words when they cut through everything to the actual point. The room was absolutely still. Alderman looked at the papers in front of him for a long time. He looked at Grove. He looked at Caleb. He looked at the children. Then he looked at Grove's lawyer and said, Mr. Cutler, given the documentation presented by Mr. Birch regarding your client's history with Eliza Marsh and the pattern of financial misconduct outlined, I am referring this matter to the Federal Marshal's Office for investigation. Your client should not leave Granger until that marshal arrives. He looked at Grove directly. Mr. Grove, you are not to approach these children or their guardian. Do you understand me? Grove sat very still. His composure had not broken. It had just gone somewhere else, replaced by a blankness that was its own kind of answer. Do you understand me? Alderman repeated. Yes, Grove said. One word. The word of a man who knew when a thing was over. Alderman picked up his gavel. Guardianship of Nora and Eli Ashford is hereby granted to Caleb Horn, to be formalized through the territorial court within 60 days. The land deed registered in the children's names is confirmed valid and will be held in trust until each child reaches legal age. He looked at Caleb. File the papers in Casper. Don't be late with them. I won't, Caleb said. The gavel came down once. The room came back to life around them. Voices, movement. Ruth McAllister pressing through the crowd with a look on her face that was not quite smiling, but was close enough. Clara Dent had her hand over her mouth again. Birch was closing his folder with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had waited 22 years for the thing he had just watched happen, and was still not entirely sure it was real. Nora did not say anything immediately. She sat at the table with Eli's hand in hers, and she looked at the surface of the table, and she was still in a way that was different from her usual stillness. Her usual stillness was watchful. This one was something else. This one was the stillness of someone letting something in. Caleb sat beside her and did not rush it. After a while, she looked up at him. Her eyes were wet. She was not crying yet, but she was close, and she was not trying to stop it the way she usually tried to stop things. "We're okay," she said. "Yes," Caleb said. Eli leaned sideways until his shoulder was pressed against Caleb's arm, the same way he had leaned on the horse that first morning, and he stayed there without moving. Caleb put his arm around the boy's shoulders. He thought about Margaret Ashford, who had given the last warmth in her body to keep her children breathing. He thought about Samuel, who had drawn horses with his son and filed land deeds and written letters that kept being useful long after he was gone to write any more. He thought about 4 years of riding west and telling himself he was running out of road, when what he was actually running out of was reasons to stop. He had stopped. Not because the weight was gone. The weight was still there. It would be there tomorrow and the day after and the day after that. And he had stopped expecting it to leave. But weight, carried by enough people, became something different. It became ballast. It became the thing that kept you from being lifted off your feet by the next bad wind. Outside, the December sky was the hard, brilliant blue that Wyoming produced after storms, and the snow on the main street of Granger caught the afternoon light and held it, and the town went about its ordinary business, in the ordinary way of places where extraordinary things had just happened, and the extraordinary thing had been absorbed, and the ordinary had resumed. Caleb Horn walked out of that church in Granger, Wyoming, on a cold December afternoon in 1878, with a 9-year-old girl on his left and a 6-year-old boy on his right, and the road ahead was long and imperfect and entirely, absolutely his. He had come west to outrun what he had done. Instead, he had walked directly into what he was supposed to do. And the difference between those two things, between running and arriving, was 2 children who had needed one specific broken man in one specific moment, and had found him there, and had decided he was worth keeping. He had been given back his life by the children of the man whose life he had taken, and he understood that this was not justice. Justice was too clean a word for something this tangled and this real. But it was something. It was the world's imperfect, generous, unrepeatable answer to a question he had stopped believing would be answered. He took Nora's hand on the left. He took Eli's on the right. They walked home.